So I think that we can conclude our formal remarks, and we'd be happy to answer any questions or just to sit down and discuss things one-on-one. And you're welcome to speak with our clients. Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any
questions?
Sure.
Is there, if you provide compensation, is there any, I guess, danger to people abusing that compensation, or is that, I mean, is that just more bone marrow that's going to be available?
Yeah, there's really no danger of abuse here, and it's because of something that's very unique about bone marrow. It is very, very hard to find a bone marrow match, and the only way that patients and recipients can be matched is using this huge national registry. Dr. Wagner talked about these millions of people who have already been typed and are on the registry. So doctors match patients using the people who are already on the registry, and those patients are matched anonymously. And so what that means is that there is never going to be face-to-face negotiation or any kind of pressure. And the anonymity makes sense because, unfortunately, sometimes when people have, in fact, often when people have bone marrow transplants, they just don't survive. And in the case of moremarrowdonors.org, what they want to do is just use funds, charitable funds that are raised from third parties to provide compensation for the donors. This isn't a situation in which the patients themselves would be paying the donors, and because of the unique circumstances of bone marrow, you could never actually auction off your own bone marrow because there would never be anybody who would actually need it. So that's why that there's no chance of abuse and why the situation is dramatically different than the kidney context. Ma'am?
So why was this rule put into place to begin with, and also what do you hope to accomplish with this?
Sure. The National Organ Transplant Act was passed in 1984, and Congress enacted the prohibition on compensation for organs to outlaw kidney markets. Congress didn't like that people would sell their kidneys because Congress thought that kidney surgery is dangerous and kidneys just don't grow back. And so they were worried about people basically auctioning their organs, flowing from poor to rich. But that situation just doesn't apply to bone marrow. Bone marrow donors and patients are matched anonymously due to random factors. There's not going to be a market for bone marrow. Bone marrow is safe to donate, and it's renewable. The evidence is overwhelming that Congress put bone marrow in the law by mistake. They just didn't understand what bone marrow is. And so what we're doing is suing the United States Attorney General under the U.S. Constitution, and we're asking for what's called an injunction, basically an order saying that the National Organ Transplant Act cannot be enforced against our clients or people like them who want to institute a program of compensating bone marrow donors strategically in order to increase the pool of donors. Okay.
How long do you think it's going to take, or I mean, is there a time frame, or
Sure.
while you
Well, we filed this lawsuit on the other side of the country, actually, in federal court in Los Angeles on Monday, October 26th. And litigation has its own ups and downs and evolves, but we expect that we'll get a decision in this case within a year to 15 months from the court. And then after that, when we prevail in the district court, it may be the case that the government will appeal. And so we'll have to go through an appeals process. So perhaps 2 years or 2.5 years from now, this case may be before the United States Supreme Court. Yes, sir.
I understand there's some state laws in place for taking time off for like blood donation. Are there any federal laws in place for taking time off to donate an organ without losing your job?
Yeah, there aren't any laws that require it. And so, it's often the case for bone marrow recipients that, they have to go into the hospital and get injections once a day for 5 days, and then they have to go in and donate, and that can be a time-consuming process. There's another way to donate bone marrow, the more traditional way. About 30% of donors donate the more traditional way, and that requires a series of injections right into your bone marrow through the hip bone. And oftentimes you need at least a couple of days off from work, and there's no legal requirement that employees be given that time off. Any other questions?
This
Ma'am?
question is for Dr. Wagner.
Sure.
Can you talk to us?
Yeah, that's okay.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about the process of donating bone marrow, the safety, and also the length of the process?
Yes. You know, as you've just heard, there's two methods of collecting the bone marrow cells that repopulate the bone marrow after transplant. The first and most conventional, traditional way has been actually collecting the marrow directly from the hips. So bone marrow is actually, if you think of a ham bone, you know, inside that central area is actually the bone marrow cavity. And by inserting a needle through the bone and then taking a syringe and aspirating or pulling back, you collect approximately, for an adult recipient, approximately 1 liter of bone marrow. That's also mixed with blood, so that's about a quart, okay? So that's one way of collecting the bone marrow. That requires that the patient have a preliminary evaluation to make sure that individual is healthy enough to go through anesthesia. Then we'll come back into the hospital for really a same-day surgery. And then just, although it's not really their classic surgery, but then is done in the operating room, however, the needles are put into the hip so the patient doesn't feel it, or the donor does not feel it. And then they're discharged later that afternoon. It's a very safe procedure. It's been done in tens, 20,000 donors, perhaps many more than that. And so that's very well established on how to best do that procedure. An alternative, somewhat newer way of collecting those bone marrow cells is through what's called apheresis, which is a machine that you're hooked up to, where the blood is actually taken from your arm, and there they collect the bone marrow cells that are circulating in your body. Now, normally that occurs. However, to increase the number of those bone marrow cells that are circulating your blood, we give you a drug called Neupogen, or GCSF. It's a stimulating factor that stimulates those bone marrow cells to leave the bone marrow space and enter the blood. That requires 5 days of those injections and 1 or 2 whole day collections where you have to sit there for about 5 to 6, 7 hours hooked to that machine where it collects those cells from your blood. So they're the two approaches by which this procedure is done. And again, many, many, many patients have had these, or donors have had this done, and it's a very, very safe procedure.
Why would one elect to use the second method of collecting bone marrow instead of the first?
Why would you select one over the other? Well, the reason why many people have selected the collection of the blood cells is because of the fact that it has associated with less pain. You can imagine that you're going to be somewhat sore in your hips after a needle has gone through multiple times through your bone. However, both are safe. However, going through anesthesia has its own risks. You can, as you may know from your own experiences, may make you feel somewhat nauseated afterwards. You have to be monitored for a period of time in the operating room and in the recovery room. So many people will select the collection of the blood marrow stem cells as an alternative. Although that requires more time sitting there, it's not associated with anesthesia or in those side effects or the soreness afterwards, other than just putting a needle into your arms. Okay?
Is the last process similar to platelet collection?
It's very similar to platelet collection, yes.
And let me just add one thing. If you visit www.ij.org, which is our website, we have a video up about this case, and there's a photograph in the video of a patient donating bone marrow using the method of collecting marrow cells from the peripheral blood, and you can see that fellow is just sitting there. As a matter of fact, Mike has very recently gone through this process. So you can actually describe what it was like for a donor, because there is a process by which patients sometimes will donate their own bone marrow, in removing some healthy bone marrow when they have a disease like lymphoma, and then get some treatment, and then take their own healthy bone marrow and transplant it back in as a sort of a first-line treatment before you go to a transplant from a stranger. So maybe you could actually just describe for a minute what it's like.
I'm in an interesting position as an IJ client in that I've both had a bone marrow transplant and been a bone marrow transplant donor. And the donating process, I went to a clinic in Denver, and basically you're in a recliner all day. There's a machine that takes the blood out, just like you would do a blood donation, circulates it through, runs it about 5 or 6 times through, and extracts these cells. And I sat with my computer and watched TV. So the donation process in 70% of the cases is relatively painless. It's just a matter of being able to draw out the time, have the time to be able to do yet, but no after effects. I think if more people understood that that's an alternative in most of the cases versus the more painful bone marrow extraction, they would be open to the process.
Yeah, sure.
So first off, it's important to actually talk to people that have actually had it done to them. I, as the doctor, only prescribe it. They actually can tell you what it's truly like. But I also wanted to point out to you, because you bring up an important point that you've just heard, and that is in some cases and in some diseases, you can actually use your own bone marrow. And obviously you could say, well, why don't you do that always? Because you always have yourself. So why don't you always do that type of transplant? That only works for very specific diseases, such as lymphoma and in some cases of multiple myeloma. It doesn't work as well for leukemia and doesn't work as well for the bone marrow failure syndromes, because if you don't have any bone marrow to begin with, you can't collect it. So that does work, but very, very specific diseases. Clearly, what we know is that if you want to get the anti-cancer effect that is typically associated with bone marrow transplants, you need to have someone else serve as your donor. And what do I mean by that? Transplant, graft versus leukemia effect or lymphoma effect. What I'm referring to and what we know is it's not actually just the chemotherapy that we prescribe that kills the cancer. It's also having cells from somebody else. That immune system from the donor actually repopulates within the patient after the transplant. And that new immune system goes around the body and finds those residual cancer cells and kills them. So that also provides that anti-lymphoma leukemia effect that you can't otherwise get when you use your own cells for purposes of transplant. And that's why I think that Jeff's indicated to you that in some point in the future, you may need to have an allogeneic transplant, that is someone else as the donor, to get that enhanced anti-tumor effect of using somebody else as a donor. Just wanted to clarify that.
Ma'am?
It seems like you have a pretty strong case against the Attorney General, but you did mention that the government it's possible that they will appeal it. Can you talk about a little bit about what the grounds would be that they could appeal it?
Sure. What we're trying to do under the Constitution is strike down a federal criminal statute. The National Organ Transplant Act says that if you try to use scholarships to save lives, you can go to prison for 5 years. And so when we prevail in front of the district court, the Attorney General may decide, and it seems likely the Attorney General will decide, because the Attorney General has a responsibility to defend the laws of the United States as constitutional, it is likely that the Attorney General will appeal. And so what would happen then is you go to an intermediate court of appeal, in which case it will be the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals out on the West Coast. And after that, when we prevail at that stage, the Attorney General may choose to appeal to the United States Supreme Court. And that's how litigation works.
If the Attorney General understands your case and says, okay, this was probably put in by mistake, is there a chance he might just stand down?
Probably not for the Attorney General, because as I said before, the Attorney General is really, the way to think about it, the Attorney General is the government's lawyer. And so the Attorney General's job is to plead the government's case. Now, it is possible that this case may get the attention of someone in Congress, and they may say something like, come to us and say, listen, why don't we sit down and talk, and maybe there's a way to amend this law to allow this to go forward. And if that were to happen, we would be happy to bring our expertise and our knowledge and work with them and do whatever we can to make sure that the people who need more bone marrow can get it. But it's unlikely that that particular gesture would come directly from the Attorney General. Yep.
Why was this case filed in LA if this one is from Maine and you're based here in Arlington?
Okay, so that's a great question. Now, we have clients from all over the country. For example, Mike is from Colorado. The Majumder family is from New Jersey. Doreen is from Maine. Akeem and his family are from Texas. But moremarrowdonors.org is a California nonprofit. And moremarrowdonors.org is the nonprofit organization that wants to set up the pilot program to determine if, as we are nearly certainly believe, if strategic compensation to bone marrow donors will increase the donor pool and save lives. And so it makes sense to bring the case in California where moremarrowdonors.org is. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you very much for attending, and thank you for your interest in the case. And please do follow up at www.ij.org, which has a variety of other materials for you. And we're also happy to answer questions individually. Thank you.